There's a video that appeared on Reddit 3 months ago and was deleted within 48 hours. Someone had filmed it through a car window, driving past what looked like an abandoned property in rural Virginia. But it wasn't abandoned. In the grainy footage, you can see figures moving in the yard, women in long dresses that brush the ground, men in suspenders and wide-brimmed hats, children running barefoot through mud. No electricity lines run to the house, no vehicles sit in the driveway, and then, just before the video cuts off, one of the figures turns toward the camera. A woman, maybe 30 years old, maybe 50. It's impossible to tell. Her face is gaunt, her eyes hollow, and she's staring directly at the lens with an expression that users described as pure terror. The video was posted with a single caption, "Found them, the Ridgewood Clan, they're still there." Within hours, it had 60,000 views. Then it vanished. The account that posted it was deleted. Every copy that had been downloaded was flagged and removed by Reddit moderators, citing privacy violations. But people had seen it, and people started asking questions. Because the Ridgewood Clan isn't just some isolated family choosing to live off-grid. There's something far stranger, far darker. They're a family that has been living as if the modern world never happened, as if every technological advancement, every social change, every law passed in the last 150 years simply doesn't exist. And in 2024, after more than a century of hiding, they were finally discovered. What investigators found wasn't just a family stuck in time. It was a nightmare dressed up as history. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The Ridgewood Clan's story begins in 1887 in the mountains of southwestern Virginia, near the border with Kentucky. A man named Ezekiel Ridgewood purchased 4,000 acres of dense forest and rocky terrain for almost nothing. The land was considered worthless, too steep for farming, too remote for logging, too isolated for anyone to want it. But that's exactly what Ezekiel wanted: isolation. According to county records that were recently unearthed by researchers at Virginia Commonwealth University, Ezekiel had been a preacher in a small Appalachian community, but he'd been expelled from his church in 1885 for what the elders described as doctrines contrary to Christian teaching and dangerous to the souls of the faithful. No specific details were recorded, but letters between church leaders suggest that Ezekiel had begun preaching about the end of the modern age, claiming that industrialization was a biblical plague, that trains and telegraphs were tools of Satan, and that true believers needed to separate themselves completely from the corrupting influence of progress. He gathered followers, about 30 people, mostly families from the poorest parts of the region, people who were already living on the margins of society and were receptive to his message. They moved onto that worthless land in 1887, and they built what Ezekiel called the sanctuary. It wasn't a town. It wasn't even really a commune. It was a deliberate recreation of pre-industrial life, frozen at a specific moment in history that Ezekiel considered pure. No machines, no modern tools beyond what existed in the early 1800s. No contact with the outside world except for the bare minimum necessary to survive. They built log cabins using hand tools. They farmed using methods that were already outdated by the 1880s. They made their own clothes, their own candles, their own everything. And most importantly, they cut themselves off. No mail delivery, no census takers, no tax collectors. The land was so remote and the trails so poor that for decades, local authorities simply forgot they existed. What makes the Ridgewood Clan different from other isolated communities, the Amish, the Mennonites, or even other religious separatists, is the totality of their rejection of the modern world and the increasingly disturbing rules that Ezekiel established to maintain that rejection. The Amish, for example, make conscious choices about which technologies to adopt and which to refuse, and they maintain relationships with the outside world through commerce and limited contact. The Ridgewood clan did none of that. Ezekiel declared that even knowledge of the outside world was contamination. Children born in the sanctuary were taught to read using only the Bible and books published before 1850. They were taught that the year was still somewhere in the early 19th century, that the outside world had fallen into chaos and sin, and that they were the last righteous people on earth. But here's where it gets darker. By the early 1900s, Ezekiel had begun to establish rules about marriage and reproduction that went far beyond religious doctrine. He declared that Ridgewood blood was sacred, that it had been purified by isolation, and that introducing outsiders would corrupt the entire community. Marriage outside the clan was forbidden, but the clan was small, maybe 60 people by 1910, and the genetic dangers of a closed population were already becoming apparent. Children were being born with deformities. Infant mortality was high. Several children suffered from what we now recognize as genetic disorders caused by inbreeding. Ezekiel's solution wasn't to allow outside marriages. It was to double down. He began arranging marriages between first cousins, then between uncles and nieces, and eventually, according to testimonies that would emerge over a century later, between siblings. He justified it with twisted scripture, claiming that the patriarchs of the Bible had done the same, that purity required sacrifice, and that physical afflictions were tests of faith that God imposed on the chosen. Anyone who questioned this was subjected to what Ezekiel called correctional prayer, which involved being locked in a root cellar for days at a time with no food, only water, while the community prayed over the closed door for the demon of doubt to leave the person's body. Ezekiel Ridgewood died in 1924, but his son, Josiah, took over leadership of the clan with even more rigid control. If Ezekiel had been a fanatic, Josiah was a tyrant. He expanded the rules, adding layers of control that transformed the sanctuary from an isolated religious community into something that resembled a prison. Josiah declared that leaving the sanctuary, even temporarily, was a sin punishable by exile, which in practical terms meant death, because anyone raised in the sanctuary had no skills to survive in the modern world, and no knowledge of how it functioned. He established a system of informants within the community, encouraging members to report anyone who expressed curiosity about the outside world or who questioned the clan's way of life. Those who were reported were brought before what Josiah called the Council of Elders, but which was really just Josiah and 2 of his brothers, and they were subjected to public humiliation, physical punishment, and in extreme cases, banishment into the forest with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Most people who were banished were never seen again. The clan assumed they died in the wilderness. Some probably did. But decades later, when investigators began piecing together the clan's history, they found records of strange reports from the 1930s and 1940s, people emerging from the mountains, disoriented and malnourished, speaking in an archaic dialect, wearing homespun clothes, and claiming to have escaped from a place where time had stopped. Most of these people were assumed to be mentally ill and were institutionalized. Their stories were never investigated. By the 1950s, the Ridgewood clan had been living in complete isolation for more than 60 years. The original members who had come with Ezekiel were all dead. The current population, estimated at around 80 people, had been born in the sanctuary. They had never seen a car, a telephone, or an electric light. They had never heard a radio. They had no idea that World War II had happened, that man had walked on the moon, that the world had changed in ways they couldn't even imagine. To them, it was still the 1800s, and they were still living in Ezekiel's vision of purity. The first real hint that the Ridgewood clan still existed came in 1978, when a group of hunters got lost in the mountains and stumbled onto what they described as a settlement that looked like it was from 100 years ago. They reported seeing log cabins, people dressed in old-fashioned clothes, and fields being plowed by hand. When they tried to approach, they were met by several men carrying what the hunters described as old rifles, like from the Civil War era, who ordered them to leave. The hunters reported the incident to the local sheriff, but when deputies went to investigate, they couldn't find the settlement. The terrain was too difficult, the trails too overgrown. After a few days of searching, the sheriff's department gave up, concluding that the hunters had probably stumbled onto private property, and that whoever was living there had a right to be left alone as long as they weren't breaking any laws. That was the attitude that allowed the Ridgewood clan to continue existing, hidden in plain sight, for another 46 years. Because technically, they weren't breaking laws, at least not in ways that were visible to outsiders. They paid no taxes, but the land had been purchased outright in 1887. And as long as no one from the clan interacted with government systems, there was no way for authorities to know they existed. They didn't register births or deaths. They didn't attend schools. They didn't apply for social security numbers. They were in every legal sense invisible. But inside the sanctuary, the situation was deteriorating. By the 1990s, the effects of multiple generations of inbreeding were undeniable. Medical researchers who later examined members of the clan found genetic abnormalities that are typically only seen in populations that have been isolated for many generations with a very small founding population. Physical deformities were common: cleft palates, club feet, dwarfism, severe nearsightedness. Mental disabilities were even more prevalent. Many clan members suffered from developmental delays, learning disabilities, and in some cases, severe cognitive impairments that made independent living impossible. The leadership of the clan, now in the hands of Josiah's grandson, a man named Elias Ridgewood, interpreted these afflictions as signs of spiritual weakness rather than genetic consequences, and he established an even more brutal system of control to manage what he saw as a community falling away from righteousness. Elias Ridgewood was 47 years old in 2010, and by all accounts from people who later escaped, he was the most dangerous leader the clan had ever had. While Ezekiel had been a fanatic and Josiah a tyrant, Elias was something worse. He was calculating. He understood that the clan was dying. The population had actually decreased to around 60 people. Infant mortality was so high that nearly half of all babies born didn't survive their first year. Adults were dying young from preventable diseases and untreated injuries. The gene pool was so compromised that Elias could see the future clearly. In another 2 or 3 generations, the Ridgewood clan would simply cease to exist. His solution was horrifying in its logic. He began forcing marriages at younger and younger ages, reasoning that more pregnancies would offset the high infant mortality. Girls as young as 13 were married to men twice their age. He personally arranged every marriage, often pairing close relatives, fathers with daughters, brothers with sisters, because the clan's population was so small that even first cousin marriages were becoming difficult to arrange without doubling up on already compromised genetics. Women were expected to be constantly pregnant. Those who failed to conceive or who suffered repeated miscarriages were blamed for spiritual failings and subjected to punishment. Days of fasting, isolation, public confession of sins they hadn't committed. Several women died from complications during childbirth because Elias refused to allow any contact with outside medical help, insisting that faith and prayer were sufficient. The children who survived grew up in an environment of fear, malnutrition, and indoctrination so complete that many of them reached adulthood without understanding that they were living in the 21st century. They believed because they had been taught their entire lives that the outside world was a wasteland, that cities were ruins inhabited by demons, and that they were the last humans living in accordance with God's will. It sounds impossible. How could people in 2010, in 2020, believe such things when the modern world was just miles away? But that's the power of total isolation. When every person you've ever known tells you the same story, when you've never seen evidence to the contrary, when questioning is punished with violence, you believe. The discovery of the Ridgewood Clan in 2024 happened almost by accident. In March of this year, a wildfire broke out in the mountains of southwestern Virginia, part of an unusually dry spring that led to fires across the Appalachian region. Fire crews were deployed to protect nearby towns, and as they worked to establish fire breaks, a crew stumbled onto structures that weren't on any map: rough cabins, fenced fields, a small cemetery with wooden markers. At first, they assumed it was an abandoned historical site, maybe an old logging camp from the early 1900s. But then they saw smoke coming from one of the chimneys. Someone was living there. The fire chief made the decision to approach and warn whoever was there about the fire. What happened next is documented in the body camera footage of the fire chief, footage that was later sealed by court order, but which has been described in detail in depositions. As the crew approached the main cabin, people began emerging from the buildings. Men, women, children, all dressed in clothes that looked like costumes from a historical reenactment. Homespun fabrics, bonnets, suspenders, bare feet despite the rocky ground. The fire chief called out, trying to explain about the fire, offering to evacuate them to safety. The response was panic. The clan members didn't understand what the fire crew was. They saw the uniforms, the trucks, the equipment, and they interpreted it as an attack. Some ran. Others dropped to their knees and began praying loudly. Several men emerged with old rifles, though they didn't point them at the crew, just held them in shaking hands. One woman was screaming in a language that the fire chief later said sounded like English, but wasn't. A dialect so archaic and strange that it was nearly incomprehensible. The fire chief made the decision to back off and call for law enforcement and social services. What followed was a tense standoff that lasted 3 days, with the wildfire burning closer while authorities tried to figure out who these people were and how to help them without causing a violent confrontation. Eventually, a negotiator managed to establish communication with Elias Ridgewood, and it became clear that the clan had no idea what year it was. When told it was 2024, Elias didn't believe it. He insisted it was 1889, maybe 1890 at the latest. He had no reference for dates beyond what had been passed down through oral tradition and the records kept in the clan's Bible. The negotiator explained about the fire, about the danger, and after hours of discussion, Elias agreed to allow the clan to be temporarily evacuated. What investigators found when they were finally able to access the sanctuary was worse than anyone had imagined. The living conditions were medieval. Cabins with dirt floors, no running water, no sanitation beyond outhouses. The cemetery contained over 200 graves, many of them children. Medical supplies were non-existent. The clan treated illness with herbs and prayer. The school, such as it was, consisted of a single room where children were taught to read using a Bible printed in 1847, and were instructed in a curriculum that hadn't changed since Ezekiel's time. But most disturbing were the people themselves. Physical examinations conducted by state health officials found evidence of severe malnutrition, untreated infections, dental problems so extreme that several adults had lost most of their teeth, and genetic abnormalities consistent with multiple generations of inbreeding. Psychological evaluations were even more troubling. Many clan members exhibited symptoms of complex PTSD, learned helplessness, and a complete inability to function outside the rigid structure of the sanctuary. When shown photographs of modern cities, cars, airplanes, several people became hysterical, insisting the images were demonic deceptions. Others simply couldn't process what they were seeing. Their brains had no framework for understanding a world with skyscrapers and highways. Children who had never seen their reflection in anything but water or polished metal were terrified of mirrors. Adults who had never used electricity flinched away from light switches. And through it all, Elias Ridgewood insisted that this was persecution, that the government was trying to destroy the last righteous community on earth, and that allowing his people to be corrupted by the modern world was a fate worse than death. The legal and ethical questions surrounding the Ridgewood clan are unprecedented. Virginia authorities immediately took custody of all minors under 18, 32 children ranging from infants to teenagers. But what do you do with children who have been so thoroughly indoctrinated that they believe the modern world is literally hell? How do you teach a 15-year-old who reads at a second-grade level and believes that automobiles are demons? Foster families who volunteered to take in Ridgewood children found the experience overwhelming. The children had night terrors, refused to eat unfamiliar foods, and in several cases, tried to run away to get back to the sanctuary. One 14-year-old girl attempted suicide within a month of being placed in foster care, leaving a note that said she couldn't bear to live in the land of the damned and wanted to die pure. She survived, but the incident raised serious questions about whether removing the children was actually helping them or simply traumatizing them further. The adults presented an even more complicated problem. Legally, they were victims of a cult, of abuse, of systematic isolation and indoctrination. But they were also perpetrators. Evidence emerged that Elias and several other male leaders had been forcing underage girls into marriages, which is statutory rape under Virginia law. Physical abuse was rampant. Child labor laws had been violated for over a century. But how do you prosecute people who genuinely don't understand that what they were doing was wrong, who were raised in a system where such things were not only normal but mandated by religious doctrine? Prosecutors decided to charge Elias Ridgewood and 3 other senior men with child abuse, unlawful imprisonment, and failure to report deaths. The trial, which is still ongoing as of this recording, has been a media circus, with Elias refusing to acknowledge the court's authority and insisting that he's being persecuted for his faith. His defense attorneys are arguing that he's a victim himself, raised in the same isolated system, and that he lacks the mens rea, the guilty mind, necessary for criminal conviction because he genuinely believed he was doing right. The property where the Ridgewood clan lived has been seized by the state of Virginia and is currently the subject of multiple investigations. Archaeologists and forensic teams are examining the cemetery, trying to determine causes of death for the hundreds of people buried there. Preliminary results are disturbing. Evidence of deaths from preventable diseases, malnutrition, and in several cases, blunt force trauma that suggests violence. One grave, when exhumed, contained the remains of a young woman, probably in her 20s, with fractures consistent with severe physical abuse. Her skull showed signs of repeated head trauma. She had been buried in an unmarked grave away from the main cemetery, suggesting she had died in disgrace or as punishment. The clan's records, written in ledgers going back to 1887, have been seized and are being analyzed by historians. They document every birth, marriage, and death in the clan's history, and they paint a clear picture of genetic collapse. A founding population of about 30 people that had intermarried for 5 generations until the gene pool was so compromised that survival was no longer viable. Geneticists who have studied blood samples from clan members say that the level of inbreeding is comparable to what you'd see in endangered species with critically small populations. Some clan members are homozygous for genetic markers that should be extremely rare, meaning both parents passed on the same defective gene, which only happens in very small, isolated populations. The long-term health consequences for survivors are severe. Many will require lifelong medical care for conditions that could have been prevented if they'd had access to modern medicine and a more diverse gene pool. As of now, November 2024, about 43 adult members of the Ridgewood clan are living in a transitional facility in Virginia, a kind of halfway house designed to help them adjust to the modern world. The process is slow and painful. Simple things that we take for granted, using a flush toilet, turning on a light switch, understanding that food comes from stores rather than being grown or hunted, are completely foreign concepts that require patient teaching. Some are adapting better than others. A few younger adults, particularly those who had harbored doubts about the clan's teachings, have expressed relief at being in the outside world and are working with therapists and educators to build new lives. One woman, Sarah Ridgewood, 28 years old, has become something of a spokesperson for the survivors. In interviews, she's described growing up believing she was living in the past, the confusion and terror of the evacuation, and the slow, difficult process of accepting that everything she'd been taught was a lie. She's learning to read modern English, to use a computer, to understand history and science, but she's also grieving for the life she lost, for the siblings who died in childhood from treatable illnesses, for the years of her life that were stolen by Elias's fanaticism. Other clan members are less receptive. Several elderly members have refused to adapt and spend their days in the facility praying for deliverance from what they still believe is a satanic realm. They refuse modern medicine, refuse modern food, and in some cases, refuse to speak to anyone outside the clan. Psychologists working with them say that for these individuals, the trauma of discovering that their entire world was false is simply too much to process, and they've retreated into denial as a survival mechanism. It's likely that some will never fully accept the reality of the 21st century and will die believing they were kidnapped from God's sanctuary by forces of evil. The question that haunts everyone who's learned about the Ridgewood clan is how this could happen in modern America. How could a group of people live for over 130 years in conditions that resembled the early 19th century, suffering abuse and genetic collapse, without anyone noticing or intervening? The answer is uncomfortable because it reveals gaps in our systems that we'd rather not acknowledge. The Ridgewood property was private land, purchased legally in 1887. As long as the clan didn't interact with government systems, didn't register for Social Security, didn't file taxes, didn't send children to school, there was no mechanism to discover they existed. The few times they were glimpsed by outsiders, like the hunters in 1978, authorities investigated half-heartedly and then dropped it, assuming it was just private citizens who wanted to be left alone. We have a cultural bias toward respecting privacy and religious freedom, which are good things, but which can also create blind spots where abuse flourishes. The Ridgewood clan existed in one of those blind spots. They were hidden not by sophisticated deception, but by remoteness, by our assumption that such things don't happen here, and by the simple fact that no one was looking. Now that they've been discovered, we're forced to confront the reality that isolation and fanaticism can preserve themselves for generations, that children can be born into systems of abuse and believe it's normal, and that the modern world's reach is not as complete as we like to think. There are probably other groups out there, smaller maybe, less extreme perhaps, but similarly isolated, living according to rules and beliefs that the rest of us would find incomprehensible or horrifying. The Ridgewood clan wasn't discovered because of great detective work or investigative journalism. They were discovered because a wildfire happened to burn in the right place at the right time, forcing contact that both sides had spent over a century avoiding. The legacy of the Ridgewood clan will be debated for years. Are they victims or perpetrators? Is Elias Ridgewood a monster or a product of a monstrous system? What do we owe to people who have been so damaged by isolation and indoctrination that they can't function in the society that's trying to help them? These aren't easy questions, and there are no clear answers. What we do know is that the children born in the Ridgewood sanctuary didn't choose their circumstances. They were born into a system that stole their futures, their health, their ability to make informed choices about their own lives. And now, those who survived are trying to build new lives from scratch, learning at 20 or 30 years old things that most people learn in childhood, processing trauma that most therapists have never encountered. Some will succeed, some won't. And the haunting truth is that every single one of them lost years of their lives to a delusion that started with Ezekiel Ridgewood in 1887 and was maintained through fear, violence, and the terrifying power of total control. The sanctuary is being demolished. The Virginia state government has decided that the structures pose a health hazard and that preserving them would only serve as a magnet for dark tourism or as a rallying point for the few clan members who still believe in Elias's teachings. By the end of this year, the cabins will be gone, the fields will be left to return to forest, and the only remaining evidence of the Ridgewood clan will be the cemetery and the records locked in state archives. But the people remain. The survivors carry the Ridgewood legacy in their DNA, in their memories, in the way they flinch at loud noises or wake up at dawn because a lifetime of farm work trained their bodies to a rhythm they can't break. They carry it in the way they speak, in that strange dialect that's a linguistic time capsule from the 1880s mixed with generations of isolated evolution. They carry it in the diseases they'll pass to their children if they have children, genetic damage that will echo forward for generations even now that they're free of the sanctuary. The story of the Ridgewood clan should terrify you. Not because it's a ghost story or a horror movie, but because it's real. It happened here in America in the 21st century. A family lived as if the modern world didn't exist, as if all the progress, all the knowledge, all the technology of the last 150 years was irrelevant. They lived in squalor and suffering, believing it was righteousness. They married children to adults, brothers to sisters, because a man over a century ago decided that purity required isolation and that questioning required punishment. And no one stopped it because no one knew. That's the real horror. Not that it happened, but that it happened invisibly. That 137 years passed with people being born, suffering, and dying in a place that was less than a day's drive from major cities, from hospitals, from help. The Reddit video that started circulating in August is still out there somewhere, copied and saved despite the attempts to scrub it. If you look hard enough in certain corners of the internet, you can find it. And when you watch it, when you see that woman turn toward the camera with that expression of pure terror, you'll understand why it was deleted. Because it's not the terror of someone afraid of being filmed. It's the terror of someone who's seeing proof that everything she believed about the world is wrong. That the demons her grandfather warned about are real people with real machines. And that her entire life has been a lie sustained by the people she trusted most. That's what the Ridgewood clan represents. The capacity of human beings to trap themselves in delusions, to inflict suffering on their own children in the name of faith, and to persist in darkness even when light is just beyond the fence line. They were discovered in 2024, but how many others are still out there, hidden in mountains or forests or deserts, living in their own versions of the past, waiting for a wildfire or a wrong turn to bring them into contact with the world they've spent generations avoiding? We don't know, and that's what should keep you awake at night.